Hello, everyone, and welcome to Make It Mindful, the podcast where we explore how to keep schools relevant by looking through the lens of mindfulness and asking the question, what's really worth paying attention to here? My name is Seth Fleischauer. My co host Lauren Pinto is on a break, but together we delve into the world of education by interviewing change makers and focusing on practical, transformative solutions for teaching. And this week, our guest is Jed Stefanowicz. Welcome, Jed.
Awesome. Thank you, Seth. Perfect pronunciation, too. It rhymes with
Rhymes with
Bananowitz.
Bananowitz, yeah.
It always works. You can tell I'm an elementary educator at heart, right? Thanks for
Well,
having me.
yeah. Thanks for being here. We met a few months ago. We had some great conversations about what you are up to in the Northeast there. So I was very interested in having you come on and share some of your insights, especially around AI, which is something that you've been doing a lot of thinking about, but also around your work of creating content making spaces in schools. And that's a little bit of your background. So maybe I stole some of your bio there, but could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure thing. And you're right. I have been doing a lot of thinking and hopefully more thinking than talking about AI. And we'll talk about why I think that's important.
Uh,
But yes, my name is Jed Stefanowicz. Right now, I'm the Director of Digital Learning and Innovation at a regional school district, Neshoba Regional School District here in Massachusetts. And before that, I was a digital learning coach for 6 years. Before that, taught third grade for 22 years. And before that, I was a child. So this is the only thing I've done, and this is, where I belong. And I'm pleased to hear kind of one of your subtitles of this is the was it change makers? Was that the word
yep,
you used?
that's in there.
Change
Yeah.
makers. So between change makers and mindfulness, I love that we're talking about the human side. And even though my world has always kind of intersected with technology, we're talking about how we're using that technology and how that integration really, at the end of the day, is about student learning. And sometimes that gets overlooked. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. And I feel like we're speaking the same language here. This is a lot of stuff that I that I talk about in terms of mindfully applying technology to the classroom. That is my favorite way to apply technology to the classroom. But this podcast is called Make It Mindful. Um, right out the gate, what does it mean to mindfully apply technology to a given classroom?
Well, I mean, there's so many different ideas of what mindfulness looks like, whether it's breathing exercises or whether it's being intentional about our decision making, our spending, the pedagogical choices, the instructional lifts. And that's kind of where my mojo is beyond thinking about what are the devices we're using, right? And especially post COVID, um, where we're seeing a lot of pushback or a lot of hopefully it's a back swing, not a back slide, that kind of
Hmm.
rejection of classroom technology. I think it's a really interesting time, whether it's the coaching or whether it's the leadership role. Um, for me, the mindfulness is about the intentionality. And that's kind of what my new book is about, is being intentional, being thoughtful, being purposeful, and really, like I said, at the end of the day, having it be authentic integration for the short people in the room.
uh, so children and short teachers, is that
Okay,
who?
sure.
Yeah, okay. Uh, so I think about this sometimes. The idea of like being intentional about your application of technology. Um, does it matter to you what the intention is? Right? Like, because you can imagine a situation where there are some pretty misguided intentions of any given teacher, whether it be because they're young or they're burned out, or maybe they're stuck in a system of reaction rather than response. Do you work with people on the intention behind the technology at all, or are you just starting with their intention and then saying, okay, that's your intention, I have to assume that that is authentic, and I will go from there?
That's a good question. And part of it, it's kind of a coaching classic, right? Is to not lead with what my agenda is, but really figure out where someone's coming from and what is it that they're trying to do, whether it's what's the thing behind the thing. And yeah, if it's, if someone's doing strictly a word processing project that they've done for 25 years, I would push to stretch it a little bit. But that's kind of an interesting way of approaching it. It's kind of been my secret way in, is to target those teachers. It's interesting that you talked about young teachers or burned out teachers, and then everywhere in between, kind of the unfair rap that new or younger teachers with maybe more technological savvy, there's this unfair advantage that somehow they're going to have the pedagogical knowledge to know how to be more intentional, whether, and then you've balanced that with veteran teachers who are pros at their craft and an unfair expectation perhaps for them to have learned everything that comes along. You know, you turn away for 5 minutes and then your neighbors are all using Blooket and you're like, where did that come from? You know what I mean? So there's an interesting piece there, but um, yeah, I would say my gateway in is to always kind of start with the project, start with the vision of what a teacher is trying to do, and really stretch that out, and then ask, okay, if, and that's why I called my book Beyond the Bulletin Board, because if they're truly just word processing and they're hanging that same thing on the bulletin board that they've been hanging for 25 years, okay, I'm not going to say let's rip that down, but what I would say is how can we increase that audience? Who are you making that printed class book for? Can we think about reimagining what the student publishing looks like? And then that gets to the intentionality of, okay, what's the purpose of student publishing? What are we trying to do? And then at the end of the day, the kind of core principles of making that thinking and understanding, demonstrating that learning publicly. Now we've got different tools to do that. So
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, the intention might be the same. It's just the tools that we have can really broaden the reach, and we have those powerful tools in our pockets.
And so I'm hearing a little bit of your personal philosophy in here because you're talking about using technology, students using technology to create content in lots of different media. You're also talking about using technology to expand the audience, right? The connectivity that technology can bring. Are there other categories of application that you work in when it comes to mindfully applying technology to education?
Well, you know, of course, looking from an inclusive and an equitable point of view, really, how are we engaging every student in the room? So the engagement itself from a mindfulness point of view, but also really hearing from every voice. You know, I remember when I was learning to be a teacher back in the 1900s, and there was that idea of, do you remember what every student was wearing today? And if you don't, that meant you weren't paying enough attention. And I
Oh,
would
I'm
stretch that
terrible at
now,
that.
right? But now
I
I'd
just don't
stretch it
know.
and say,
Clothes? I don't know.
well, what I'd say now is let's stretch that to, have you heard from every student today? And
That's
then, so
better.
taking that, right? And having heard from every student doesn't mean that they have to raise their hand, because that's about that teacher's agenda. That's not about how you're engaging that student. So, how do we think about hearing from students, and how do we invite them to engage? And so, from a mindfulness point of view, that way, um, and that's where I think there's a UDL, and that's where I think actually AI can be doesn't mean it automatically is a tool to stretch some of that thinking and expand the ways that we engage students.
Okay, so you just used two abbreviations: UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and AI, Artificial Intelligence. What is the intersection between those two things from your perspective?
Well, I am a teacher and we do love our acronym, so you'll have to excuse. uh, there isn't, it's not an obvious intersection. And when we look at the kind of core principles of UDL, Universal Design for Learning, it's those multiple modes of expression, representation, um, engagement, right? Action and expression. Um, that I think is where we're hopefully at the phase of the AI integrating into classrooms. There's that quote, Belsky, I don't remember his first name, but what he said was that novelty precedes utility in reference
Hmm.
to AI. And I think we've been now in a year and a half of, we're hopefully crossing that novelty period where everyone goes and they do the amazing things that AI can do. And now we're thinking more about, okay, what's the utility? And that's where you see products that are kind of rising up, is that they're the utility that we're thinking about integrating are those ways to, how do we broaden the engagement? How do we broaden the expression? How do we use AI to give us additional ideas that either we might not have thought of? Now, when we introduce that tool, I think we introduce potential pitfalls as well. Or when we introduce those shortcuts, I think that can come at a cost too. So, like I said, I've been doing a lot of thinking as well as a lot of talking, because it's exciting and it's great. And you can, with a couple of presses of a button, you can take a standard and have it build your units and your slides and your bulletin board ideas and your extension ideas, and you can level up and level down, and you can suddenly reach and teach every student in the classroom, maybe in a way better than that classroom teacher would be able to do on their own. But I wonder if there's a cost to that process.
What do you wonder the cost is?
Well, I mean, I think one piece is, yes, it does save time for the teacher, right? And I like that idea of giving teachers back their time to pay attention to the more important parts of our craft. But I wonder if there will be this kind of general erosion of a teacher's subject matter knowledge or their content expertise if the AI is taking, okay, what are the next 2 weeks of my unit? And I think a skilled teacher, I don't think it's going to happen with a skilled teacher. But, when you're having the AI do the lesson planning in place of perhaps the research and learning you would be doing, I just wonder if there's an erosion of that process.
Hmm.
I know it's one of those things. In 5 years, we may look back and say, huh, we had these really rapid fire, really, there's an increased depth of learning, I think, in some cases where we're thinking of all these different ways of engaging students and different ways of asking students to demonstrate their learning, and where AI is maybe giving us multiple ways of doing that, which is awesome. But I do wonder if, I don't, that's why I really wrestle with it, because it's giving, I think, a classroom teacher maybe ideas that they wouldn't have come up with on their own, so that's great. But is it doing some of that lift for the teacher that then they don't have to do it on their own? I don't know. It'll be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, the teachers that I work with, it's interesting when you have veteran teachers who are not necessarily afraid of the technology. They know how to use it. They're experimenting with it, but the answers that they get from it, there's an inherent skepticism that is born of decades of experience and an ability to analyze the answer in a way that you can only do so if you are a subject matter expert. And I think about the new teachers coming up and the allure of being able to lean on this technology to do, to make you more effective sooner, right? But the question there is, are they going to be able to exercise that critical thinking to understand what a good response is or not? Or will it even matter in 5 years because the tech is going to be so good that they'll be able to guess whatever context is necessary in order to produce the best possible answer? I mean, right now there's so much that goes into prompt engineering and giving it the right context and asking it to assume a persona, and all this work that is the science of the now. But will that be necessary? And ultimately, how much does any of it matter, because it's coming anyway, right? So so like that same fear that people had of like the internet ruining, like Wikipedia being rife with misinformation, which is hilarious given that it's the most trusted source on the
Right,
internet now.
right.
The rest of the internet is the problem. But that initial fear of the internet, and I do think that this is a different technology, right? It's uniquely human. This generative AI, the way that it can speak to you, the way that getting to know these tools is kind of like getting to know a person. That the most effective way to work with it is to learn about it, to learn it, and how it responds to different scenarios. So I think that there are some fundamental differences here, but I do wonder if this is just if we're just watching change happen, right? Like you're worrying that there could be these pernicious effects of the technology, but ultimately, is it just how it's going to unfold?
Mm, pernicious. Exactly. And I think you answered. I think you answered and asked the same question. I think we're going around and around. It's funny that you use the phrase "uniquely human," because that's when I talk with teachers or at workshops, I kind of use that phrase. What are the uniquely human processes that are either being skipped, shortcutted, or um, and it does go back to that validation of the skilled teacher who looks at the information that comes back and then gives it that glance over, or hopefully knows whether that information is valid or not, or how they're then going to. And I think what it speaks to is using the tool as your starting point. And inevitably, I either have something explained better, gone a little deeper, it gives me extra ideas, but it's that starting point, and it's not doing the work for me, but it's extending the thinking. And that's where Greg Kulowick was the first one I heard use the phrase thought partner. And I really,
Mm.
for me, that makes a lot of sense as a thought partner, because it's an exchange, right? So yeah, the uniquely human piece, we can't skip that human in the room ever.
Hmm. Yeah, when we've talked, you've talked about AI serving as a tool, the idea that it shouldn't detract from what the essence of quality education is. I'm wondering, how can we modify our teaching approaches to prepare students for this AI influenced world, right? So like this is coming. Like what do we need? Do we need to teach them anything, right? Like there's a point of view of Justin Reich, who's on the podcast recently, who was talking about how not too many schools necessarily suffer from not being early tech adopters, right? From like sitting back and waiting to watch and see what happens and then jump in once the technology is fleshed out a bit. But it feels like there's this like anxiety right now with a lot of, especially like tech forward teachers who are like, oh my God, not only is this here now impacting the world, but it's changing at a potentially exponential rate. Like I would be doing an absolute disservice to my students if I did not prepare them for this world where this is going to have continue to have a major impact. So where do you see that? Like, what is our responsibility as educators to shift what we're doing in order to accommodate for these coming changes?
The healthy skepticism that you talked about, I think, is a really key factor. And Justin Reich is I'm so glad that you had him on recently, and I can't wait to go back and listen. I could listen to him
Oh yeah,
talk all
that's right.
day,
You introduced me
and
to him. Thank you.
and he would talk all day. I had the pleasure of seeing him twice in the past month in person, and every time I talk, you know, he's so easy to talk to and listen to, but he's also one of the smartest humans and you've ever talked to, and it's like he really pushes your thinking
Yeah.
in a very research-based, strong way, but also in a really normal human way that always has kind of that student-centered focus, right? So I think, to get back to your question, um, how to get back to the essence, I think the healthy skepticism, asking the challenging questions, and it doesn't mean we can answer them. What it means is, like you said, it's already here. It's going to increasingly be everywhere. Um, so that requires us to ask those questions. And I think asking them collectively, trying to come up with answers specific to our own context, whether it's our school, whether it's setting guidelines. I think it's still early for policy. But guardrails and guidelines, I think, are really important to have an approach. So moving from the skeptical questions, which are, like we were saying, what's lost in the process, really, how does it ultimately impact student learning? What are the tools that we're using, and are they supporting the teacher or the teaching? Not that one is better than the other, but that gets to the intentionality of why we're using the tool. And then moving toward a more optimistic approach. And that's where I think from the skeptical view can grow us into the more intentional integration oriented questions where, okay, how might AI enable or extend student understanding? Or how can it be integrated into lessons to promote more personalized learning or engage the learners who might not otherwise be, eyes up or engaged in whatever metric the classroom teacher is looking for to measure the engagement of the students. So I think, and it is more, I think, optimistic. Um, how can we use, the emerging tools to give more timely, targeted, specific feedback? And that's a really complex question because, you know, it brings up equity questions too. Are if you're in a district that's locked and blocked versus one that isn't, are those graduates leaving? Right? We just heard Adil Khan talk about it, I think, just this past weekend, where graduates are getting to college, and some with a huge leg up that others haven't. But even within one classroom, students have with tools in their pocket, and the student at the desk next door without that tool in their pocket, do they have that personal tutor? And if that personal tutor is giving specific targeted feedback that might honestly be better than waiting for the teacher's feedback, but maybe even better than the teacher's feedback because it's instant, it's there. It just raises questions. And again, I don't think they're easy questions to answer, but I think they're really important questions to talk about.
So, speaking of questions, you have written about 5 critical questions for evaluating AI in education. I'm going to read them here, but I'd love to hear your rationale about like these set of 5 being the 5, right?
Yeah, and I think these
Um,
are the skeptical ones.
okay. So, what human processes are being automated? Does their automation result in a loss of educational value? Is AI functioning as a support for teachers or as a direct teaching mechanism? And that's what you were just mentioning.
Mm.
What is the impact on student learning? And how could it foster a deeper understanding or enhance assessment methods? So you arrived at these 5. Um, in your mind, how are these like the be all and end all? Like why stop at 5? Why have these 5? Like tell me about your thinking.
Yeah, well, they're definitely not the be all end all, and they're not the biggest, but I think they're the good first ones because it engages um, people in the room. It engages multiple players in the room. Um, and just like if you've seen Matt Miller's scale of,
Mm-hmm.
uh, how much what's cheating, kind of where's your line on that ladder. I love that because it's a way of engaging people who aren't the tech people in your building, aren't just the administrators, but it invites people into the conversation. And I think these questions. So, the first one: what human processes are being automated? So, okay, if there is that goal of reclaiming teachers' time, kind of keep it surface level there. Okay, great. But again, what's being shaved off and what is the teacher not doing that, you know, and by not doing that, is there a cost? So that leads to the second one, which was, does that automation result in that loss of educational value? So I never like hearing that idea of a shortcut because a shortcut seems to me like, you're skipping something. If you're increasing the efficacy, if you're giving the teacher time to divert to more useful, cognitive tasks, then there's value in it. But I like that idea of the added value versus the shortcut or the loss.
Mm-hmm.
Is AI functioning as a support for teachers or as the teaching mechanism? Again, that's is supporting the teacher or the teaching, and that's where it's pretty interesting to look at the emerging leaders that have figured out how to have more student facing, right? So for there, I think about Magic Student and I think about School AI. And by the time this airs, who knows? There might be 3 others, right? Because everyone seems to be coming up with them. But there's a reason I think that those are the leaders, and I think it has to do with the accessibility and the on ramp for the general classroom teacher, and not just the tech specialist in the building. And I'll come back to that. What's the impact on student learning? I mean, obviously, that's what it's all about. If there isn't an impact, if it's just administrative tasks, I think then we're stuck in the novelty before the utility phase. And yes, the wow before the how is great, and wow is it awesome, but it doesn't get to the how and doesn't get to the utility. And I don't think it's a sustainable view in a way that's going to shift the teaching that's happening. And then how can it foster the deeper understanding or enhance the assessment? I think that is those next set of the more optimistic questions that I was talking about, where it's more um, extending learning, supporting interaction, supporting ways that and that's the UDL part of it too, right? How are we adding opportunities for expression? How are we widening the walls to increase engagement and produce the different pathways for students to demonstrate what they're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting because just really it really speaks to the fact that like any piece of technology, this is a tool, and the thinking that goes into the tool is everything. Right? Like you can't just take a hammer and throw it around randomly and hope to build a house, right? Like you've got to have some thinking behind what you're doing. And I talked to a bunch of different people in the ed tech world, and it seems like no matter what the tool is, so much of the professional development is like, well, let's just talk about what good teaching is. Like, let's just back up there. And then if you do that, our tool's great for you. But if you don't do that, we've noticed our tool's not that great. And and I think that,
Well,
like, sorry,
I
yeah.
was just going to say it's such a simple but such a powerful sequence. It's such a flip where because what you're talking about is leading with the intention, right? Leading with the learning and let the tool follow. And if I think about FETC and ISTE in the past year and how many hundreds of sessions were AI sessions, and they were all like wine tastings. And they were all, well, try this, and have you heard of this? Have you heard of this? And they weren't about wine pairings. And that's what you're talking about.
Mm,
So now, I'm leading a staff meeting tomorrow afternoon. And for this middle school, I'm introducing like, for the first time this idea of wine pairings, because okay, is it lead with the use case? I want to translate a document. Great. Let's go with that singular task. Here's the tool I'd use for that. Here I want to extend or differentiate a quiz. Okay, this is the tool I might use for that. Now I want to think about fleshing out my unit design. Here's the tool I might use for that. But just that idea of leading with what's the use case rather than leading with the tool, it switches it from a training, right, staff meeting
yep.
where
Mm-hmm.
you're immediately people literally are opening their lids to block you to real use case, and it's conversations, and it again, it invites different people in the room to think about the things that they're already doing, they've always had to do as highly skilled teachers, and now we have tools to maybe support that differently. It's a lot different from I'm going to train you how to use Diffit or Brisk or Magic School or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a more learner centered approach, right? I do want to shift gears a little bit here. In your book, Beyond the Bulletin Board, one of the things that you most fiercely advocate for, much like Trevor Saponis, who has been on this podcast, who I introduced you to, is about placing student voice and agency at the forefront of educational strategies. Um, I'm wondering why you believe student agency is so essential, and which is not. I'm not suggesting that it's not. However, I do wonder if there's a possibility of like a pendulum swing too far in a certain direction, right? There's a certain amount of like although we don't no longer have like the teacup method of education where there's a teacup full of knowledge and we're pouring it into our students. There's something to be said for certain processes, certain ways of doing things, certain knowledge being passed down from those who have it to those who don't. And while student agency is something that I think in the traditional methods of schooling was way too ignored, I wonder if there's a danger of venturing too far in the direction of student agency, and making it so that when kids get to the real world and they're like, wait a minute, I can't like control everything in my like entry level job. This is boring. I'm gonna go somewhere else and do something else, right? Like, and maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the point. Is that like when you give students agency, they demand change of a society that is not built around some of our better ideals, maybe. But I don't know. There was a lot there.
Yeah,
Respond.
tell me how you really think.
No, and I look, like honestly, like Deirdre Marlowe, she listens to this podcast and gives me feedback sometimes, and I am giving her voice right now. And it's she's a big fan of the classics. I talked to several people who are big fan of like classical education, and not totally abandoning what has worked from the traditional educational system. And I know that as I work with students in Taiwan, there's a certain amount of traditional approaches that we take with these students because they are used to that and it works for them in their setting, right? And there are certain students for whom it does work, right? But I'm also, in other circles and in other conversations, I'm the radical pushing the student agency thing. So, so but I'd love to hear your perspective on it so that I can borrow your words the next time I'm arguing with Deirdre.
Sure. I can't imagine now having met Deirdre. I can't imagine you ever argue. But I will say, I think you kind of put the answer, or I found the answer kind of hidden in your something you said, which
Okay.
was, or at least the answer for me. And so yes, this is the book, Beyond the Bulletin Board: Crafting a Culture of Content Creation. And Dr. Michael Connor was nice enough to give early praise and be a reviewer. And he kind of said, this is Dewey 101. And
Mm,
I love that he said that in the context of a technology integration idea, because it wasn't about the tools, it was about the teaching. And when you talked about student agency and the pendulum, right, you said, well, what's going to happen when these kids reach the real world? And that's where I'm going to pause and say, well, there's the split right there. Why is it that, right, their experience in the classroom is so separate from the real world? Why isn't it that we're not, that the classroom doesn't reflect the real world? And that is what, my kind of mission as a teacher, a coach, now an administrator, is to have our classrooms really reflect the real world, so that when they do leave school and they graduate and they go to college or they go to the workforce, the real world suddenly isn't slapping them in the face and they're being met with that brick wall. But they are, that's where I think, everyone has their portrait of a graduate. That's where I think it can be a lot deeper than just that poster on the wall. And we can push past the poster, because I love my alliteration too, that the portrait of a graduate and those competencies, we're really being honest about what those competencies are. We're really being honest and hearing from graduates that, what didn't you get when you left? What aren't we giving you? And that is, I think, what can lead. And that's what becomes real about student agency, rather than just, you know, because I think what you're talking about is examples of student agency, which are not really at the heart of what student agency is all about. And I'll tell you, 5 years ago, we had a really hard time saying what student agency was, what it looked like. It was a little more of a buzzword. And then COVID came along. And then students came back to school, and teachers lost their minds and said that their students kind of forgot how to do school. They forgot how to walk in line. They'd never been on a field trip. They didn't know how to take turns. And what we're finding was that loss of agency. And that, I think, was a way that I've been able to have student agency go from being this kind of ambiguous concept to something that was a really tangible thing that teachers could latch onto. And then it gave us areas to work. It had nothing to do with technology. It had to do with, what's the community building in the classroom? How are students, the students who might have been more engaged at home in hybrid and remote, and now they came back and they were met with this kind of disconnect, you know, and I think what it did was it gave some bones and real, tangible ways of saying what student agency is, isn't. And, for me, learning loss was never something that made any sense to me. It was something
yeah.
that vendors in the trade shows were using to sell products. What we were really talking about was the loss of student agency and
So
teacher agency too, as a matter of fact.
so let's just back up a little bit so you can connect these dots for me. Like what is agency to you?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Um, it's student empowerment. It's students feeling engaged. It's students feeling like, they have some, either control in the direction of their learning, but they have some control in the expression of their learning too. And it's also there's the self advocacy. Now it's interesting because I'm a lifelong elementary educator. So that student agency there is the ability to take turns, the ability to walk in line, the ability to, make a choice on a choice board, or acknowledge the fact that a choice board is not necessarily student choice or voice. It's one of three choices that the teacher has chosen, rather than really chasing the student's passion area. Or at the middle high school level, it is really those passion projects. It is really that student who, um, has historically been disengaged, or honestly hates school and has been blamed themselves for it. It's giving them the ability to engage and or re-engage with school in a way that's empowering, and it validates and affirms their identity, but it also validates and affirms the learning process too.
So would you say that it's then the ability to act on your opinions, passions, and identity? Is that about right?
Sure. And to
So
know that, and to have, and to have those matter, because if they don't matter, then it's just baloney. And that's more about the ecosystem than it is about that student.
and so do you see it mattering in the real world, agency?
I I do, and I'll give you an example of um, a recent graduate named Sophie Smith, who I met at FETC,
And who
and I
you
might.
introduced me to and who has been on the podcast.
All right, so you know, wow, I introduced you to two home runs, right?
Yeah.
So that's a great example of agency, student agency, because what began as her kind of bailing on an assignment through TikTok became what is now her. She's the CEO of a company. She's the exact age of my daughter. Graduated from college last year, and they just got their $1 million seed round, and
Yeah.
she has overseeing this really impressive company and organization that's mission oriented, and it's really an impressive thing. And that's what I think about that agency, is the ability to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think that I think you're absolutely right with someone like Sophie, right? And where she was able to put together her skills, her interest, her passion, her courage to be able to take agency and make it work for her in the real world. And I wonder uh if the style of education that prioritizes student agency isn't necessarily a philosophy that we should apply to everyone, but it's one that works really well for some kids and not as well for other kids.
Yeah, I'll concede. I hear where you're going, and I'll say uncle, but I will say, no matter how much the revolutionaries, the pendulum's not going to swing too far. Don't worry, because the measures we have and the measures we have in place are always going to be rooted in the standards, and the metrics that the districts need, and the standardized tests that are going to be rooted in such a way that are in some ways antithetical to the the crusaders of agency. That hopefully there's going to be a good balance, that those
Yeah.
who need the nuts and bolts, it's going to be there, the foundational work will be there, so that the dreamers like you and me can fly high, or Sophie too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think of because I've been doing a lot of thinking throughout my career about like how can we make this better, right? Like our system is clearly broken. There are legions of students who are disengaged and who think that school is not for them. How can we take that, change it, and make it so that they feel like learning is a benefit? And I think that the answer for me over and over again is like it depends. It depends on who it is, on what their culture is, on what their preferences are. I just think about my own family. I have two kids. My son is absolutely a Sophie Smith, right? Like I could see him uh first of all really struggling in a system where he was asked to like do exactly what the teacher was asking him to do, and really thriving in a system where he's given certain parameters but can explore at will within those parameters. My daughter gets overwhelmed with choice and really excels at doing what people ask her to do and doing it well. And I think about just at my own company, like there are certain roles where I want people to be absolute free thinkers and creative, bring creative energy and make things and break molds. And other people whose job it is to like keep the foundation where it is.
Someone's
And
got to keep the trains running on time,
yeah,
no
yeah,
doubt, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I think that like I sometimes need to check my own romanticism when it comes to what I think education could become or should be, or because I that student agency piece, that student centered piece, that like letting kids just drive, like that entrepreneurial spirit, like that is so enticing, and it resonates with me. But I try to check myself and remember that that's not necessarily the answer for everybody.
it isn't the answer for everybody, and that goes back to, at the beginning of your rant. I mean, the beginning of your last comment. you you talked
Touche.
about you talked about, maybe school isn't for everyone, and that's the truth. And but instead of trying to change their mind, it's trying to, how do you change the system, or how do you change you and knowing that maybe you're not going to change the system, how do you change the trajectory for that one student? And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's romanticism to think that we have the power to do that. But those levers don't fit for all, right? But for someone for whom school isn't for them, can you make their experience matter? Can you make school for them? Can you make their experience for them? That's that's supporting student agency. That's voice and choice for real. And that's, at the end of the day, it's also mindfulness, because you're supporting that student, and it is student centered. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it full circle there. I also think that it's a real opportunity for this new technology, right? Personalization of learning is one of the applications that we're seeing right out the gate, and I imagine that it's only going to get better. So a teacher being able to, I uh, create a detailed profile of each of their students, and then have a lesson plan and like feed those detailed profiles in there and be like, how should I approach this based on the interests, abilities, and inclinations of each of my students. I think that there's a lot of potential there.
And I say,
And
don't let the machines do it, right? Don't let the AI do it. Have it be that partner, because if and it can be as simple as looking at personalized learning, which is a passive outcome, and just taking off one little letter D to have it personalize the learning, right? And that changes it from being the intended outcome or the optimistic outcome to really putting it on the teacher. And the teacher needs to be the one to personalize the learning for the student. And
yeah.
technology can help, but we're hopefully not having technology take care of it for them.
Hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jed, for being here, for sharing your expertise, for sharing your opinions, your candor, for calling me out on my rant. I appreciate all of that. Last question: where can our listeners find you on the internet?
Uh, Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me, and it's a great conversation. It goes by so fast. I've now talked to you a couple times, and it's like we're old pals, and we get it all worked up. You can find me or my books. I have a website, jedpd.com. Jed, that's me. PD for professional development.com, and you can find my books and everything cool there is to know. And my books are on Amazon. If you're interested in learning, you know, more about what we've talked about. And I look forward to meeting you in person somewhere along the way, Seth, because I know it'd be cool to grab a bite.
Yeah, are you going to be at ISTE
I will.
perchance?
I
Hey,
will.
there you go. I'm going to a Rockies game the day before. You interested?
I think I could be interested. We'll see. We'll talk. We'll talk
Uh,
offline.
all right,
You
sounds
can you
good.
can find me presenting in the playground on Monday afternoon. I just found out. So yes,
Oh,
I'll be
cool.
presenting. So and yeah, maybe we can cook up a little something, and hopefully doing a few podcasts too.
Yeah, I'm presenting with my colleagues from CILC, my other podcast, Why Distance Learning, and we are presenting at the Denver Museum of Arts and Sciences. We are going to be recording a live podcast and having like training the audience on how to podcast, and then having them interview us about our content providing of distance learning as the live podcast recording. It's going to be
That is
pretty
so
cool.
cool.
Yeah.
When the first time we had a conversation, we had talked about, I think I was introduced to you or vice versa about being on that podcast. And honestly,
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm on this one. This was the right choice. And that's a cool museum. The last time ISTE was in Denver, I was at an event in that museum. And it was a wicked hailstorm, and it was all coming in under the doors. They had to block the doors because these, chunks of ice were raining down on like a 95-degree afternoon. So I
Oof.
have cool memories of that place.
Oh, hopefully no ice storm in June. But but I look forward to meeting you in person. Thanks so much for being
All
here.
right. Thank you so much.
And for our listeners, if you'd like to support the podcast, please tell a friend, subscribe, leave a rating or a review. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Lucas Salazar. And remember that if you'd like to bring positive change to education, you must first make it mindful. See you next time.